In this video, I'm going to be using the Prince instrument in order to make this interesting 808 that you just heard. Let me go ahead and queue up the instrument device and we can get started on our patch. I'm going to make it a little bit larger. We'll queue up that blank initialized patch, which you can download in the course materials, or you can always just double click on the various different parameters while holding shift and everything will reset to its default state. But then after that, we can go ahead and get started on making our patch. There's no bass presets that are currently available inside of this device, but what we can do is use a lot of these different elements to create bass sounds, because a lot of these plucks and stuff, whenever you play them a lot lower, can act as a really nice bass stab. So what we'll do first is go ahead and pick kind of like a sine wave type tone, and then we'll use that as the main basis for the 808, and then we'll blend in some nice texture elements on top of that. Let's go ahead and go over to layer A. We'll select that, and I'm looking for number 12. Which is going to be this basic waveform. It sounds like this. So whenever it's played high up, it acts as a lead synthesizer patch. Whenever you drop this down, it takes on more of the characteristic of a modulated Reese bass. And this will be the perfect start for creating an 808 stab bass. Because what's really interesting about this patch is it has a lot of texture and distortion, and it sounds similar to an 808 that you'd hear on a lot of modern pop or trap productions, but it has something that's a little bit different, a little bit more texture, and that could just add a really nice unique quality to your songs. Then let's go ahead and pick another layer to layer on top of this. It's going to have a little bit more attack, a little bit more snap, and enable us to get kind of a nice crunch on everything. So we'll go ahead and go to layer B. I'll move the blend control all the way over to layer B so we can just hear just this instrument device. And then I want to go down to the preset click keys, which is going to be number 30. It sounds like this. So it's like a bass stab or a lead synthesizer stab, or like an arpeggio thing. Whenever it's played super low, it gets this really nice, like chunky attack quality to it. That'll be super nice on our bass. And then we have to go ahead and blend these together so that way it feels like one cohesive sound. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust that blend knob. And right now, this basic layer is playing super low. We're going to adjust that here in a moment, so don't worry about that too much for now. Right now, I'm trying to just get a nice blend between this upper layer and this top layer. I think I like it just about there, so in between the blend and unlink control right there. Now let's go ahead and first play around with our amplifier envelope to make this snap, and then we'll address some of the pitch variation and stuff with the pitch control here. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and add just a little bit more snap to this bass. So that way we can almost use the amplifier envelope like a transient shaper. What I want to do here is have a nice snappy decay. So we're trying to just add a little bit more of like an attack snap of the initial transient. I'm going to put that at 200, and then I'm going to go ahead and put this sustain up, but I don't want to put this all the way up to 100%. I'm going to go ahead and put this down to like 68 or so. So what that's doing is just adding a little bit of a volume snap down to the sustain point. So it's going from attack of basically 0. It's providing a little bit more snap on the start of that, and then going down to the sustain point. So it just gives you a little bit more of that attack transient. Then depending on how long you'd like your 808 to be, you can go ahead and increase that release. Maybe put that at like 907. But depending on how long or how short you need that kick to be, you could go ahead and play around with this parameter. This will also depend on the production you're working in and the BPM that you're also working in as well. Because this is an 808 bass, I don't want any velocity variation, so let's make sure that this is on the linked mode here. So we're going to go ahead and select layer A on linked and go ahead and turn off the velocity variation, because I don't want my keyboard or the MIDI to control the volume of everything. I want each note to have the exact same volume. We're going to go ahead and turn that on. And then we could start playing around with the source controls. So the first thing that we want to do over here on the source is to kind of address the fact that this lower layer right now, playing super low. This sounds nice at this octave, but this just becomes way too low. So let's go ahead and go to layer A. We will make sure that those are unlinked. And I want to drop layer A down 1 octave. So now whenever I go up 1 more octave, everything just feels right. We get that nice low end from this bass over here, but then this layer B also has a nice crunch. But it's not so low that it kind of loses its snap. And while we're over here too, let's go ahead and link these and make sure that both of these are set to legato. So that way we can do little 808 slides and stuff. So if the notes are overlapping, then we can have those nice slides. But if I play individual notes, it gives me a little bit more expression on that bass. Then it's time to start playing around with our filter. Let's go ahead and not worry about filtering out layer A because it's more of like a sine wave, respace type thing. But I'm going to go ahead and filter out just a little bit of this crunch on layer B and make more of a snap with the filter. So I'm going to go ahead and select this layer. I'm going to go ahead and reduce that filter cutoff curve. I'm going to go ahead and just put the blend control all the way over here while we're working on this. That way we can hear exactly what we're doing. And let's go ahead and crank the amount slider. And by the way, this is just for layer B. Layer A is unaffected. We're trying to just create more snap for this layer because this kind of acts as like the attack transient of the 808. So we want this to have a nice and snappy quality. This is what this sounds like once we increase the decay. Also increase just a little bit of attack. So we're adding this basically in, that kind of subtle filter movement. You don't need a ton of that, so we'll put that at 2.4K. And then whenever I blend that back in with my other signal, especially when that's played really nice and low, it starts to give me more snap on my 808. And then the final thing that we will do for that layer is crank that release all the way up. So that way that filter doesn't instantly snap down after I release my key, especially because we have this nice and long release on everything. We want to make sure that that filter stays open or stays closed once the modulation finishes. Then I want to use layer B and create just a little bit of a stereo movement because this acts more as the top end layer. This 808 is starting to get there, but it needs something that's just a little bit more interesting. So let's add just a little bit of movement to the pan control on this upper layer. So that way our sub bass stays intact and stays nice and mono compatible. We can add a nice little stereo wideness to this, which is something you hear quite commonly on 808s. So let me crank that all the way up. Again, that is just layer B, that's not layer A. And then we're going to go ahead and increase this until we get kind of a nice movement. So whenever this is set too low, it just sounds like a weird auto pan. Whenever this is set up nice and high, it starts to almost sound like a stereo widener effect. And that way everything's modulating back and forth. It just creates a little bit of nice width on my 808. Depending on the intensity of the panning effect that you're going for, you could always decrease this. But for me, I like that nice and wide 808. I find it is a bit more interesting. So we're going to go ahead and keep that at 100% on the pan control. Then it's time to start messing around with some of these effects. This is really where this 808 is going to come together. So let's go ahead and open up the noise, make sure that is turned on. We're going to leave that on type 2, which is just this noise right here. Has this nice top end sort of sizzle to it. And that nice white noise will actually give my 808 a little bit of brightness and a bit more fullness in the top end frequencies. And it'll just kind of make everything sound a little bit more crunchy, especially once we start distorting it. We don't want too much of this because I don't want to make this just a noisy 808. We're going to go ahead and put this down to basically its minimum value. So we're just going to go 99% on the left. So it's adding just a touch of brightness to this 808. And by itself, it doesn't sound like much, but once we start distorting everything, those top end frequencies will crunch up and it'll sound nice and full. So let's go to that distortion. Let's open that up. Probably leave that at type 3. That's starting to sound a lot more interesting. Let's reduce that gain. I like the sound of that. We could probably reduce the dry wet. Then we could play around with that gain control. Think about % of 1 on distortion type 3. And then the dry wet's going to be at 45 on the left, 55 on the right. And feel free to play around with these other distortion types, depending on how crunchy or distorted you want that 808 to be. We can always play around with this later too once we have everything set up. That's a nice part about having everything on an instrument device like this. So I can kind of set up my 808, set up my patch, and then tweak it as needed. Turn on that chorus. That'll kind of help wash out the sound and really bring it all together. So before and after. much more interesting. And honestly, we could probably just leave this on its default state here. So the depth is 85.9. The rate here is at 0.9 hertz. Stereo is 100%. Dry wet is at 82 on the left and 18 on the right. And that gives us this really interesting textured 808 sound. We took some of the different presets that are available inside this instrument and made a totally new sound out of them and made our own customized bass. Altogether, it sounds like this. And if you're curious what those notes are, let me go ahead and just scroll down. Very simple note pattern. Basically what's happening here that makes it interesting is these little bits of variation in between. Octave jumping or jumping up to notes on 808s or creating slides can make them a lot more interesting. So that's what we have going on here with that MIDI. And with the hi-hat and snare, it all sounds like this. So that wraps up this video, and that also wraps up this course. I hope you enjoyed this series, and if you did, make sure to check out the other courses and videos on Groove 3's website for more music production, mixing, and mastering tutorials. So thanks again. I'll see you in another course soon.